Ocarina of Time is a timeless, genre-defining masterpiece, and no one on God's green earth can ever convince me otherwise. Yeah, using the iron boots was tedious, the camera control sucks, and the graphics look like you took a piece of origami and drew a face on it, but I don't care about that. I am not the target audience for your criticisms or your hot takes. This game has cemented itself so firmly into my brain that whenever the word nostalgia pops up somewhere, all I see is a picture of Ocarina of Time. Not only does it represent a big part of my childhood, it's where my love for the series first started. Ocarina of Time was my first Zelda game, and with so many things in life, your first tends to hold a special place in your heart. Now, ever since I started this channel, I've been yearning to do some sort of retrospective of my own. However, trying to bring something new and insightful to the table about Ocarina of Time has become close to impossible at this point. In the 25 years since its release, it's been picked apart on almost every conceivable level. We're talking countless hour-long analyses, breakdowns, and trivia going over every little thing that makes the game tick. As such, I feel like the only thing I can really offer at this point that could be considered truly unique are my own memories and experiences from back when I first played it. Because even though we all played the same game essentially, the circumstances in which you did will differ from everyone else's. You know, how old you were when you first played it, whether you played it alone or with a friend or a family member. Did you play it on release or years after the fact, and on which hardware? These are all contributing factors to how you perceive Ocarina of Time, and thus each and every one of us has their own unique stories to tell. And today, I want to tell you mine. So sit back, relax, and let me take you back to the past and talk about my experience with Ocarina of Time. Before we get into the game itself, I feel like I need to outline a proper setting, especially for those of you under the age of 25. So most of what I'm about to tell takes place between 1998 and 99, which puts me between the age of 11 and 12. Now, unless you worked in the industry at the time, most of what you knew about video games came from magazines, TV commercials, and good old-fashioned word of mouth. The internet did exist technically, but it was primitive to say the least. This was still before Google, before MySpace and other social platforms, so if you even owned a PC to begin with, which definitely was not a given, you kinda just had to know vicariously which websites to go to for gaming related content. You know, stuff like news, walkthroughs, forums, cheats, and so on. Not only that, but this was years before broadband, so we were still using dial-up at this point to access the internet. And for those who don't know what that means, just count yourself lucky. I also want to preface that at the time it was very common for me to play games with other people in the room, which in my case were my two cousins. And I'm not just talking about multiplayer because, you know, that goes without saying, but single player games as well. In fact, most of the games I quote-unquote beat at the time I didn't actually finish all by myself. Instead, we would all hurdle around the TV and pass the controller around while others watched. Just keep that in mind whenever I use the term we instead of I. Anyway, the year is 1998, and the tragedy of Titanic and Jack's physics-defying death scene were still fresh in everyone's mind. Our story begins not with Zelda, actually, but with another legendary title, GoldenEye 007. This was the game I was obsessed with around the time Ocarina hit the scene. The campaign, unlocking cheats, multiplayer, slappers only, of course. I got the full James Bond experience. Despite the fact that I did grow up with the NES and SNES, I was completely oblivious to the Zelda franchise up until now. I don't know, it just never got on my radar for some reason. I do remember seeing my neighbor's kids play A Link to the Past for a brief moment and thinking it looked really cool. However, they were predominantly PC gamers, one of only a few kids in my neighborhood who were. So I don't know, I guess they must have been using an emulator or something, if that was even a thing back then. Or maybe they did have a Nintendo, but were simply using a computer monitor as a TV. Or maybe I'm just misremembering, I mean, it was a long time ago. Either way, since my family didn't own a PC powerful enough to play anything beyond Minesweeper or chess, I never even bothered to ask what it was that they were playing. And so my ignorance lived on. So by the time Ocarina came out on November 21st, 1998, I was, once again, completely oblivious to the fact. The only thing I do remember quite vividly is seeing a commercial for the game on TV, and I actually found that exact commercial. I think every country kinda got their own version of it. I know there's the infamous UK commercial that said something like, "Will you get the girl or play like one?" Imagine doing that in 2023. But yeah, I'm pretty sure this is the version I saw on TV back in the day. Mainly because of this shot of Link jumping down the waterfall in Zora's Domain, which as far as I'm aware is unique to the European versions. I don't know why this shot in particular sticks out in my memory so much, since it's not exactly the most iconic part of the commercial, but I mean the human brain is just weird that way, I guess. Anyway, as you may have been able to infer by now, I didn't actually play Ocarina of Time on release day. In fact, I didn't even play it that same year. It wasn't until early 1999, a few months after the game came out, that someone finally brought it to my attention. I will spare you the exact details, but basically we knew a guy who was considerably older than we were, I think, 15 or 16 at the time, and he's the one who told us about how he just beat the new Zelda game on the N64 and how amazing it was. So really it was just a case of, well, if he played Zelda, we had to play it as well because he was older and cool. So with that little seed planted firmly into our brains, we did what most kids with an empty wallet would do at the time. We rented the game, which in our case was free since both my youngest cousin's mom and my mom worked at the local video store. We popped that sucker in, turned on the console, eventually. And well, needless to say, it was love at first sight. The animations, the world, the music, it was absolutely mind-blowing. I mean, come on, just look at those sexy polygons. I joked before about the graphics and how they didn't exactly age very well, but it goes without saying that we didn't know any better. This was it, the peak of 90s 3D graphics. Now, I know that the N64 was far from the most powerful system out there at the time, but visually, Ocarina of Time was still at the very least on par with the best in the competition. Even back then, Nintendo was pushing their inferior hardware to the absolute limit with their first-party titles, just like they're doing now with the Switch. Of course, it is worth mentioning that most of the footage of N64 titles you see online nowadays, including the stuff I'm showing here, is not an accurate representation of how we experienced it back in the day. Most of this stuff is emulated with all kinds of filters and mods applied to it. Upscaling, anti-aliasing, widescreen mods, all that jazz. The image we saw on our primitive TVs looked more like something like this. 4x3 240p upscaled, which, to be fair, was both a blessing and a curse. Sure, the image was blurry as hell and you couldn't see a lot of details, but on the flip side, those old CRTs and early LCDs were pretty effective at obscuring a lot of imperfections, especially those rough edges on 2D sprites and low-quality textures. One of the reasons why Ocarina made such a big impression on me from the get-go is that at this stage I was still used to games that utilize a level select screen or some sort of hub world. Ocarina of Time with its interconnected, living, breathing world was something I had never seen before, and the same goes for the story. Granted, a lot of it went right over my head as a kid. I mean, obviously I didn't pick up on things like subtext or symbolism, but everything you did just felt important, like you were part of something much bigger. Common nowadays for an adventure game, but for me, at that time, it was bigger than anything I had ever experienced before. This also happened to be the first game I ever played that had a day and night cycle. In fact, one of my favorite things to do was to explore Hyrule Field and in particular towns and villages after dark. There was just something about that nightly atmosphere. The sound of crows and crickets, the quirky characters that came out after sundown, seeing the light shine through the window shades of people's houses. As a kid who's basically forced to go to bed early at that age, the idea of being out after dark while the world around you is asleep truly felt like something special, something that in real life you rarely got to do. Now, as I stated before, my early interactions with Ocarina of Time was on a rented cartridge, and because of this we never managed to get very far. Every bit of progress we made was eventually halted because, it had to go back to the video store where someone else would rent it for a while, and you kinda just had to pray that your save file would still be there a couple of weeks later, though more often than not, it would be gone. And since we're on the topic of save files, in one instance while we were still messing around in the early parts of the game, we eventually let our curiosity get the best of us and decided to take a quick peek at someone else's save file. It felt like gazing into a forbidden part of the game we weren't supposed to know about yet, like skipping ahead to the middle of a book or a movie. As we booted up the save file, we were met with this, the entrance to the Forest Temple. We didn't play very far. In fact, I don't remember taking more than a few steps, probably because we didn't want to spoil ourselves even further. However, this short little moment became the catalyst for a major misconception I had about Ocarina of Time, one that I held on to for way longer than I care to admit. As the image of the Forest Temple faded into view, my cousin said something along the lines of, "Oh wow, Link is much bigger here." That single sentence made me believe that Link would gradually grow older as the story unfolds, and my brain would actually trick me into seeing it that way too. I would walk out of a dungeon and think, yeah, I think he looks bigger, he's got some more biceps going on, which of course is not true. Young Link's character model doesn't change one bit between dungeons. It just goes to show how you can be fooled into seeing something when you have a preconceived idea in your head. Even more hilarious is that in one instance the game even seemed to reinforce my delusion by saying, "Ho ho, it looks like you've gotten a little bigger and stronger already, Daan. So yeah, needless to say, I had no idea about the time travel part, which is kind of ironic seeing as it's pretty much in the title. I will cut my 11-year-old self some slack since I barely engaged with anything Ocarina of Time related prior to picking it up. I only saw that commercial once and at a glance, and with the absence of internet culture, it was much more common that you went into a game completely blind. It also didn't help that when you rented an N64 title, you didn't get the cardboard box with it, and not even the manual in most cases, both of which would have been a dead giveaway about the time travel stuff. That cycle of renting the game, playing it for a few days, returning it to the video store, and then usually having to start all over again would remain the status quo for the next couple of months. Until finally, in June 1999, I got my own copy for my 12th birthday. I came home from school, my cousins were there, and we played for hours and hours, all the way through the parts we were already familiar with and beyond. One thing I find quite poetic looking back at it now is the way I experienced the child and adult sections of the game. See, my birthday happens to fall close to the start of that big summer holiday you had between semesters. So my cousins and I would have ample amount of time to play together because, we didn't have school for a couple of weeks. Because of this, I played most of the Youngling questline in the company of other people, which was quite comforting in a way. Entering the royal family's tomb for the first time was one of the scariest, most unsettling things I had ever experienced in a video game up to that point. But at least I had my cousins with me, If things became too scary or too challenging, you could just hand over the controller to someone else and let them suffer for a while. But as the holiday drew to a close, so did most of our play sessions together. We had to go back to school, so that comfort of playing with other people largely became a thing of the past. By the time I got to the adult section, I was almost exclusively playing by myself. And it just so happens that it's at this point that the game makes a dramatic shift in tone. The world you explored as a kid had grown darker. The bright and colorful streets of Castletown were now replaced by a post-apocalyptic hellscape. There was a sudden sense of urgency. People were counting on you. I think it's one reason why the game made such a big impact on me on an emotional level compared to, say, Mario 64 or Banjo-Kazooie. Ocarina of Time is in part a coming-of-age story, and being a kid myself at the time, I essentially had to grow up alongside Link and learn to face my fears. This was even further amplified by the fact that I was on the cusp of a major change in my life. 1999 happened to be my last year of primary school. By the end of that summer, I was going to high school, which, let's just say, I was very nervous about, to say the least. I was very short for my age. I looked at least 2 to 3 years younger than most of my classmates. So the idea of going to this new place with all these kids that were way older and bigger than I was, it was terrifying, and I think a lot of people can relate to that. Going to high school is a big deal at that age. Actually, one thing that I just realized that I think is pretty cool. So just to clarify, this is not my original copy, the one I got for my birthday. That one has unfortunately been lost to time. I have no idea what happened to it. Maybe, I don't know, it got lost during a move, or maybe my parents threw it away by accident, or maybe hopefully it's still sitting in a box in an attic somewhere. But yeah, this is just a hand-me-down that I bought specifically for the video. However, this one right here, this is actually my cousin's copy, which he was kind enough to lend out to me. And well, as you can clearly see from the very obvious barcode that they just slapped shamelessly on top, as they always do, this one came from the video store, the very same video store that our moms used to work at. So yeah, I don't know, I guess at some point they started phasing out their N64 library as the system itself retired, and they must have gifted this one to my cousin at some point. Now, I don't know how many copies they had at that particular store, but it can't have been that many because, like I said, we always had to wait for someone else to return it and our save files would be gone again. So, even though I no longer own my copy, the one with my OG save file on it that I used to actually beat the game back in the day, which is unfortunate, there is at least a chance, a very good chance, that this might just be that original cartridge that we rented back when we first played Ocarina of Time, months before I got my own copy, which, I don't know, I think is a pretty cool idea that this piece of plastic might just be the first Zelda game I've ever held in my hands and put in my Nintendo to play. Now, with that personal anecdote out of the way, let me shift the focus back to the actual game itself and share some specific highlights of my first playthrough in chronological order. Those little moments that stick out in your memory the most. I already mentioned the royal family's tomb, and yeah, this stuff was absolutely nightmare-inducing. It may sound a bit overdramatic to some of you, especially given the graphics, but first of all, I was 12, and second, I had never played real horror games at this stage like Resident Evil or Silent Hill. Heck, the scariest thing I'd ever experienced was the piano in Mario 64, which sure was pretty terrifying as well, but this right here? This was a whole different ballgame. The moment I laid eyes on that first Red, I made an immediate 180 and hightailed it out of there like the coward I was. I of course did eventually come back, got the song and all that, but I will never forget how scared I was of this place. Even as a cynical adult, setting foot in this place still manages to evoke that childlike anxiety buried somewhere deep within. Another memory that sticks out for me is the fight with Baronade, the final boss of the third child dungeon, Jabu Jabu's Belly. It's not because of the fight itself, because let's be honest, it's not exactly the most memorable boss in the game, but rather the circumstances in which I defeated it. I once saw a video of James Rolfe, aka the Angry Video Game Nerd, in which he shares his story about beating Contra on the NES for the first time. He talks about playing it early in the morning right before school and then getting to the final boss.
The school bus is gonna have to wait. I'm beating Contra. My dad comes in and is like, why don't you pause it? And that's the classic parent comeback. Why don't you pause it? I'm like, well, how am I gonna focus in school knowing that I have a Contra game at home that is paused on the last stage? No.
It's something that immediately resonated with me because I also played games before school a lot. You know, right in that short little window between waking up and going out the door. In his story, he manages to beat the final boss just in the nick of time and is able to tell his friends about it. I, however, wasn't that lucky. I had been breaking my balls trying to finally beat this damn dungeon for what felt like days at that point. And when I finally walked into that boss chamber early in the morning, my time was up. I had to go to school. So I paused it. And what James said in his video about not being able to concentrate in school knowing he had a game on pause back at home, that is totally accurate. I remember sitting in class being so afraid that my mom would accidentally turn off my N64, or even that the console would somehow overheat from being turned on for too long. It was not an easy school day, let's just put it that way. Looking back, it's kind of funny because the boss room is actually not all that far from the dungeon entrance. I could have easily saved and just pick it up from there, but that's not how I saw it back then. Jabu Jabu's Belly felt like a goddamn maze at the time, and to an extent it is. It's definitely a lot less linear than the first two child dungeons. Just the mere thought of having to track through these hallways once again was unacceptable to me. I wasn't having it. Once that school bell rang, I rushed home like a madman, was relieved to see that my N64 did not in fact catch fire and was still on pause, safe and sound, defeated Baronade, which was actually pretty easy, and finally I was ready to go back to Zelda with all 3 spiritual stones. When I think back to the child section of Ocarina of Time, it feels like it took such a long time to get through it. So many countless hours, it was like a full game on its own. Of course, this is in part due to the fact that we had to start the game all over again so many times during those initial months. You know, when we were still renting it. And I'm sure it also has to do with the way you perceive time as a kid as opposed to an adult. Days and weeks just seemed to last so much longer back then, you know? The moment where I got that sneak peek into someone else's save file and seeing the forest temple and actually getting there on my own save truly felt like a lifetime ago. Imagine my surprise then when I found out that there were at least 5 more dungeons to get through. I wasn't even close to halfway yet. As for the adult portion of the game, I remember getting stuck a lot. Enemies were tougher, dungeons were suddenly way more complex. I mean, on top of having to navigate and fight your way through, you now had small keys and a boss key to deal with as well. Now, when it comes to Ocarina of Time and getting stuck, most people will understandably point to the water temple, which I do agree was a bit of a nightmare to get through the first time. However, the longest I ever got stuck, that is to say, where I made absolutely 0 progress, was actually inside the fire temple. And it's all because of this one ridiculous jump you had to make. It took me days to figure this one out, and I don't do this very often, but in this case, I'm blaming the game on this one, not myself. Because come on, how was I supposed to know that you're able to make this jump? He just magically snaps onto the ledge despite so obviously missing it by a mile. It's not even close. I feel like the only way to figure this one out is to just take a leap of faith out of boredom because you've exhausted every other option. I mean, Jesus Christ. Oh, I still get angry when I think about this part. Anyway, another huge roadblock that gave me a lot of trouble at the time were the Stalfos fights inside the Forest Temple. They did an insane amount of damage compared to anything else you faced up to that point. Their jump attacks were especially devastating, with a whopping 4 hearts of damage. I think I only had about, 7 or 8 hearts total when I got here, so that meant 2 jump attacks and you're dead. And you had to face 3 of these bastards in order to get the bow. It's actually because of this fight that I first discovered that you can bottle as many fairies as you have empty bottles to spare, which ended up being my saving grace. Naturally, the fight against Dark Link was also extremely memorable, so much so that I kept a separate save file right before the fight just so I could face him over and over again or show the fight to my friends. And yes, I did actually defeat him in the conventional way, not by cheesing him because, well, I didn't know about that the first time. The only trick I did know and found out on my own somehow was that the fight is much easier if you don't use Z targeting. It's safe to say Dark Link made a big impression on me. I even made an animation about it several years later, right before I went to college. I of course remember my first time entering the bottom of the well and getting the proverbial shit scared out of me. I mean, this was essentially the royal family's tomb on steroids, so you can only imagine. I also recall beating the Spirit Temple before the Shadow Temple, which was apparently not how most people did it the first time. I know the game does allow for it, but it also clearly nudges you towards the Shadow Temple first. I don't know, maybe the bottom of the well scared me so much that I needed a change of scenery for a while. By the time I was finally about to face Ganondorf, I felt pretty confident. Battle-hardened by all the previous challenges, I marched up those stairs of the castle, ready to kick some wizard ass. That confidence, however, turned out to be a complete facade. The first fight was pretty doable, I wasn't particularly scared or anything, but as soon as I realized Ganondorf had a second form and saw that dreadful transformation sequence, I did something I had never ever done before in my life. I paused the game, and I called up the Nintendo hotline. I am not even kidding. The image of Ganon's dark silhouette towering over you, the lightning, the flames rising up in the background, the music. It was just so intimidating that it actually made me afraid of losing against him. Which is so weird looking back at it. I mean, obviously I had game overs before, many times in fact. But for some reason this was different. I just did not want to lose to this guy. I had to win this. First try or go home. Of course, the fight itself is actually pretty easy if you know what to do, but I guess I was just so awestruck that I didn't dare to go in blind and find out on my own. I needed some pointers and quick, so I racked up my parents' phone bill just a notch, probably without them knowing. I honestly don't even remember the advice I got from them, but whatever it was, I managed. I defeated Ganon, executed the final blow, and then came the credits. It was finally done. In retrospect, the whole thing from start to finish probably took only about 4 or 5 months, something like that, and that's including the time spent while renting it, but it definitely felt a lot longer. Again, probably because of time perception as a kid. Of course, this is not where my Ocarina of Time journey would end. In the years following that first playthrough, I would beat the game many more times, which is actually quite rare for me. There's not that many games I can revisit over and over. Most of the time it's a one and done deal for me, but there are a few exceptions, and Ocarina is one of them. I must have beaten this game at least 30 to 40 times at this point, and that's not even counting stuff like randomizers or the 3DS remake. Over the years, I became a veteran at the game, and one of my favorite things to do was to show the game off to other people. I would often invite many different friends and classmates over, and when they obliged, I would always show them Ocarina of Time. I would play as flashy as I possibly could, purposely drawing out fights longer than I needed to just to make them look more intense. I was like the Jehovah's Witness of Ocarina of Time, spreading the word of its gospel. I wanted everyone to see just how amazing this game was. For every new visitor, I would usually create a brand new save file just for the occasion, which I would eventually finish all the way through again, mostly by myself of course, since they did have to go home at some point. Except for poor Timmy, I'm pretty sure he's still stuck in my old house somewhere. Anyway, I could go on for hours. Heck, I haven't even touched on the real-life Zelda-inspired adventures we used to go on, venturing into the woods with sticks and improvised shields pretending to be inside of a dungeon, or the wooden master sword my grandfather made me at my request. But I think I've rambled on long enough for one video. In fact, I would love to hear your stories about Ocarina of Time. Even though it's been 25 years and the game has since become a pop culture phenomena, back in the day I actually didn't know that many people who played Ocarina, aside from my cousins. At least not until the internet started taking off. I guess it's why I felt such a strong urge to show the game to people and talk about it. And with this channel, I've been able to do just that on a scale I could have never imagined back when I was 12. So if you will, please leave your stories down in the comments below. I'm looking forward to reading them. A big shout out goes to my cousins Daan and Mike and my brother Jesse for not only providing me with the classic hardware I needed, but also for coming over and reliving some of the past with me. It was good fun. Finally, a quick thanks to Javed from Good Blood for helping me color correct some of the footage we shot. And of course, as always, a massive thanks to my Patreons and channel members. That is all for now, and I hope to see you all next time.